Hotep Peace family, Dashan Barad here. Welcome to the first episode of my show, Expressions in Blackness, a show in which I will be interviewing and speaking with prominent Black figures about their lives and their latest endeavors. And joining us on this maiden voyage is scholar, historian, author of at least 40 books, University of Houston professor Dr. Gerald Horne. We're going to be speaking with him for just a few minutes. And I believe Dr. Horne has at least 2 books that came out this year. I'm sure he'll correct me. Dr. Horne, first of all, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to ask you first, what foundation? I know that you're a professor at the University of Houston, but aren't you a fellow? You belong to a foundation. You're like the such and such professor of history.
Well, if you go online, you'll find out that I'm the John and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. What that means is that folks struggled, students struggled, Black students and the community struggled to create a position that would create funding for a person like myself to be able to travel, as I do, to archives in order to uncover material to construct into books that hopefully will make a difference.
Right, yeah, I didn't want to mess up the name of the foundation, but by the way, family, what I forgot to mention is that Dr. Horne was educated undergrad at Princeton University, and he received his Ph.D. from Columbia University, and he also holds a Juris Doctorate. He's an all-around bad man, and I tell people all the time, Dr. Horne, about you. You know, we speak about Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, another one of my intellectual idols, who puts out a book every week. You were actually before Dyson doing that. So
I wouldn't go that far, but I'll accept that.
Okay, well, understood. So, Dr. Horne, we want you to give us a background, how you got started doing what you're doing. Now, of course, many of us within academia and many of us within media, we know who you are, but for the masses who may not be aware of your work, you know, tell us about Gerald Horne. You know, give us a snapshot of your origins and educational career, activist career.
Well, for those who really want to take a deep dive, there's a 9-part biographical series that you can find online about my life. But having said that, I was born in St. Louis to working class parents. My father was a teamster, a truck driver. My mother did day labor, as it was then called. Both had roots in the heart of darkness. That was Jim Crow, Mississippi. Migrated or fled, I should say, to St. Louis, where I was born and raised. At a certain point, what happens, as you and your audience may know, in the mid-1960s, when I was a teenager, believe it or not, the world was changing. Africa was surging to independence. The Caribbean was surging to independence. The United States found it difficult to compete for hearts and minds in those resource-rich regions. And so it felt compelled to retreat from the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow, which opened the door for people like myself to get scholarships to university. And that put me on the path that has delivered me to where I am today.
So now, Dr. Horne, you know, you, along with being a scholar, of course, you are considered to be an activist scholar. And so you've been referred to as being a Marxist scholar. Okay, what I want to know is, what was your introduction to activism and organizing? Like, in other words, I understand, your various writings, of course, demonstrate your politics, demonstrate your position, but what exactly shaped that? Were there any mentors? Were there other scholars or Black leaders that we should know about, or leaders, period, we should know about?
I think there are many streams. One is growing up under Jim Crow. If that doesn't shape you, I don't know what will, being barred from certain restaurants, for example, simply because of your ancestry. Second of all, my parents, my mother in particular, I would consider to be a kind of working class intellectual. I mean, she graduated from high school, did not go beyond, although she wanted to. But I grew up with all news radio, always on, KMOX, 1120 AM in St. Louis. I assume it's still in existence. And then I was a child laborer, which I don't recommend, but that shaped me as well, because at a young age, perhaps 6, 7, 8, I was out on the street selling the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the newspapers, and the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, fortunately now defunct. And I began to read newspapers at an early age, admittedly the sports page and comic strips. But then that put me on a certain path. And like many parents, my mother, in a certain sense, used the public library as a sort of daycare, basically. And so myself and my sisters, we oftentimes were shuttled off to the public library. And if you're in a public library, you might as well look at books as much as anything else. I think that public libraries today, you can take out DVDs and perhaps even video games, but at that point it was only books. And so that got me into a kind of a reading pattern. And of course, in college, studying history was a shaping factor, and following, I went to Princeton, and as you know, that was the place where Paul Robeson grew up. So when I arrived there, he was still alive, although, of course, he was living in Philadelphia at that time. And Paul Robeson sort of hovered over Princeton, perhaps still does, although maybe not. I'm not really sure. I haven't been there in a while. And so his example helped to put me on a certain trajectory as well.
It's important to know for our viewers is that I'm currently conducting this interview at Rutgers University in North New Jersey from the Paul Robeson Center.
Oh, good.
And Paul Robeson is another one of those unsung giants that not enough of us know about. And Dr. Horne, I must tell you that it's very sad that most people on this campus, whether they be undergrads or employees, with the exception of professors or history professors who don't know who he is. So you mentioning Robeson, and of course us mentioning your, I don't like using the term the radicalizing, but for layman's terms, what was it like, a person of your political orientation or your radical orientation, getting degrees or attending 2 Ivy League schools, Princeton and Columbia? What was that like for yourself?
Well, Princeton, let's start with that. I mean, I think it is fair to say it was a radicalizing experience, because Princeton, as you probably know, had a well-merited, well-deserved reputation as being, in the 19th century, a campus for slave owners. I don't know if it's accurate, but there was a dorm on campus called Edwards Hall, and we were always told that that's where the student slave owners kept their enslaved Africans, for example. I can't vouch for the veracity of that. And I was involved very heavily in anti-apartheid protests at Princeton, and I also spent a lot of time on the road. What I mean is that being in Newark, you know that New York is very close, Philadelphia is close, Boston is close, Washington, et cetera. So I took advantage of the geographical location and was able to escape some of the more atrocious aspects of the campus. And that too was shaping, because for the longest, and this has been written about by myself, I probably talked about it in that 9-part biographical series as well. I started going to jazz clubs in New York. And I should also mention, just to connect the dots, that I wound up writing a book about jazz. I wound up writing a book about Paul Robeson. I wound up writing 2 books about Southern Africa, one dealing heavily with the anti-apartheid movement. And so the scholarship that I've been involved in the last decade or so is deeply rooted in the experiences that I shared going back decades.
Now, were you involved? And when I should say involved, I should actually, you know what, I'm not even going to ask that question. What was your role in the anti-apartheid movement?
Well, let's start at Princeton. We were campaigning against the university's investments and corporations that were benefiting from cheap African labor. We occupied a building, the financial center on campus, which was a very informative experience insofar as a number of our so-called fellow students took exception to our direct action and came to the building chanting, "Go home." I don't think they meant go back to your dorm room. I think they meant something else by that. And then in New York, I talk about this in the book I wrote on Southern Africa. I was very active in the movement in New York City. And in fact, the book, White Supremacy Confronted, I begin the book by talking about my relationship to Ndimba Toivo Yatoivo, a founding father of today's Namibia, larger than California and Texas combined geographically, not population-wise, south of Angola, north of South Africa. And he had been freed after serving a lengthy prison term alongside Nelson Mandela on Robben Island. And so I was able to raise money to bring him to New York, actually to the United States, to tour and to drum up publicity, raise funds for his political party. And then after Namibia came to independence in 1990, I went back and collaborated with him on his memoirs. Mm-hmm. And that's how I start the book, White Supremacy Confronted.
And Dr. Horne, I must say that book right there, that book is very excellent. There's no book of yours that isn't excellent. But what we're dealing with now, some might say the age of Trump. It actually gives context to what we're experiencing right now. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not one of those that believes that in criticizing Trump and the Republicans, I criticize both sides as you do, but it still gives a context. It still gives context. So as we fast forward, during the anti-apartheid movement, of course, now, were you ever in contact with Mandela? Did you ever have any interactions with our brother?
Yeah, but not. I mean, as you know, he came to the United States after being freed in February 1990.
That's what I meant to know. Were you there? That's what I want to know. If you were.
Oh, sure. I mean, I can't say that we huddled and exchanged gossip or anything like that, but certainly as a person who was active in the movement, I was involved in that process. And as you know, I lived in Zimbabwe. In 1995, I arrived in Zimbabwe to live a year after Mandela had been sworn in as president. And that too was a shaping experience. That was 1995. He was sworn in the spring of 94. I arrived in early 95.
So what was it like your time in Zimbabwe? Let's talk about that. How was it like under that? Because at the time, of course, Mr. Mugabe was still in power at that time. What was that like? Because we hear so many propaganda regarding Zimbabwe and of course, Mr. Mugabe.
So I was there to work on a book. That was the book I wrote on Zimbabwe, From the Barrel of a Gun. So I was doing research in the Zimbabwe archives at the University of Zimbabwe. I was living there in Harare, the capital. This is before sanctions. As you know, the US and their allies slapped sanctions on Zimbabwe after the ruling party tried to reverse the fruits of settler colonialism by taking back the land that had been seized as recently as 1945 by invading Europeans. And that led to sanctions trying to drive the economy into the ditch. I was there before that whole process was inaugurated.
Right.
But even I visited Zimbabwe since sanctions. It's a very, for me at least, it was a very pleasant place to live. The weather's very nice. The infrastructure, at least before sanctions, was strong in terms of hot and cold water, electricity, paved roads, airport, etc. I would say the same thing for Namibia, even more so, because Namibia has not endured sanctions for various reasons. And so the infrastructure hasn't been tampered with like the infrastructure in Zimbabwe. So I would recommend Zimbabwe either to visit or even to reside.
So I take it you had interactions with the African Union.
Well, I would say I had interactions with the ruling party, Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU-PF. As a matter of fact, one of the leaders of ZANU-PF gave a blurb for my White Supremacy Confronted book for example. He's now involved in building a museum of Southern African liberation in Harare, which should be completed, I would imagine, anytime, any day now.
So, Dr. Horne, as we, I'm gonna focus on Africa for these next few minutes, and then we're gonna come back to this side of the equator, if you would, this side of the world. Pardon me. What were your thoughts concerning Gaddafi and concerning his death? Because, of course, as we know, many of us who refer to ourselves as Marxists or Pan-Africanists, view him in high favor. They have a positive, they look at him in a positive light. Minister Louis Farrakhan, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, James Smalls. What are your thoughts concerning Gaddafi and his assassination?
It was an outrage. It was a tragedy. Recall that Muammar Gaddafi comes to power circa 1969. He is assassinated on camera in 2011 as a result of a bombing campaign by NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, led by the United States. France played a pivotal role in that regime change, insofar as the story, the scuttlebutt was that then French President Sarkozy was getting money under the table for his campaigns from Tripoli. Dead men tell no tales, and so he wanted Mr. Gaddafi gone. And of course, Sarkozy, I've sort of lost track of him, but I think he's still in the process of standing trial. Gaddafi was moving towards trying to establish closer ties with the African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Sirte, S-I-R-T-E, the city in Libya with which he had close ties, was going to be a new kind of Pan-African capital. Gaddafi, I visited Libya under Gaddafi in, I think it was 1980, and had written a treatise on expropriation of US oil interests, which of course the regime sought to do, and that's one of the reasons why it got overthrown. But now, of course, Libya is a kind of mess. I mean, there's fighting still going on. There are two different governments, one in Benghazi, one in Tripoli. There are credible stories about Black people being subjected to forced labor. Darker skinned Africans, I should say, being subjected to forced labor. So this was a tragedy by any measure.
Okay, so we're going to come back to this side of the river. Reparations, Dr. Horne. Will we ever get it, or is it a futile quest? Because right now we've seen the last two presidential elections that's actually been on, we've actually had presidential candidates on both sides discussing this. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about reparations in the current, there seems to be right now, not seems to be, but within the reparations movement, we have people that are saying that reparations should only be for African Americans, those of us who are descendants of enslaved Africans, and not people of African descent, period, in this country. They don't have a problem. The argument that I'm bringing up, they don't have a problem with Black people, people of African descent receiving reparations, but they feel that African Americans here, those of us who are descendants of enslaved Africans, should receive it, and no other people of African descent here. What's your take on all that?
My take is basically political. What I mean by that is, we're talking about a country, the United States of America, that has wrecked or is seeking to wreck affirmative action. We're trying to go further by talking about reparations at a time when polling suggests that it is not necessarily popular amongst the US electorate writ large. That should not be shocking nor surprising, but if you look at our history, and as I've written about at great length,
yes,
if you look at our struggles, be it against slavery or Jim Crow, we've been able to prevail by lengthening the battlefield, by not making it solely a US issue, but making it a hemispheric issue, a global issue, for example. And that's what I mean by politically. That is to say, if you're really serious about reparations, you have to take it beyond the confines of the United States of America. And if you're taking it beyond the confines of the United States of America, then politically, you may want to rope in Africans of Jamaican ancestry, U.S. folks living in the United States of Jamaican ancestry, folks living in the United States of Nigerian ancestry, just as a political imperative, setting aside any other kinds of issues. So I think that's one of the failings of the reparations movement, which I try to follow, is that to an extent there is a liaison with the Caribbean. There was just a big meeting in Accra, Ghana, actually a few days ago. We're speaking on December 4th, I believe, 2003. So to an extent, there is a wing of the movement that is proceeding along that track. But I think there's a kind of lack of clarity, as my previous comment tends to suggest.
So do you agree with the concept of the ADOS and FBA movements? Have you been keeping up with that?
Well, sure. I mean, I try to understand it. And what I've written is that part of what's undergirding ADOS, in my opinion, and I wrote about this in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. There's a long footnote pertaining to this, and I've talked about this at length, is the rulers of this country, particularly the right wing, they have a special animosity towards the descendants of mainland enslaved Africans, which is not to suggest that other Black people, they pat on the back and kiss on the cheek. But materially, that just makes sense, because we're the ones who have been going, our ancestors were the ones who were going toe to toe. We're the ones whose ancestors were expropriated without compensation. If you want to make an exploiter mad, take their property without compensation. And so understandably, they have a particular hatred of people like myself, whose roots are in Mississippi, for example, which is not to suggest, to say it again, that they're loving and embracing Black people who do not have roots in the mainland of North America. There are distinctions. Just like when I traveled to London, for example, I get treated much better than folks who have Jamaican accents and Nigerian accents. When I went to Namibia, which I mentioned a moment or two ago, I got treated better than many of the indigenous Africans. But politically, once again, I don't think it makes sense when we're getting shot down the street like dogs and being treated worse than animals to try to isolate ourselves from other Black people because they don't have roots in the mainland of North America. So it's a very complex question. I think that the ADOS movement, perhaps they're also overreacting to the fact that, say, I'm sure he would regret it now, the actor of West African British descent, David Oyelowo, plays Bass Reeves in this recent Paramount picture. He once said that, well, I think I do well in North America because I don't get involved in all of this stuff that these U.S. Negroes tend to get involved in. Now, I think that sort of attitude, and to be fair, when I was living in Zimbabwe, I saw a similar attitude with regard to Black Americans who were in Zimbabwe. Because the Europeans, there was and still is a European minority, they would try to manipulate the Black Americans against the indigenous Africans, and some went for that sort of thing. So it's a very complicated question, but the political underdevelopment in the United States makes it difficult to sort out.
Okay, well, Dr. Horne, as we get ready to wind down, dear brother, you had a book that came out this year, right? Or two books?
Yeah.
Can you please let us know what they are?
One is called Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. The other is, I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader. In fact, I don't know if you have reached into Los Angeles. I'm giving a book signing in Los Angeles at Leimert Park, Africa Town, on February 3rd, 2024. Look at my Facebook page for details. And I'm also giving a book signing in Houston, where I'm now sitting, on February 1st. At the campus of the University of Houston at 5:30 p.m. Central.
I appreciate it. I would like to thank Dr. Gerald Horne for joining us on this maiden voyage of Expressions in Blackness, and definitely we plan on having him back very soon. Dr. Horne, it was certainly my honor, and I think you just may have made my week. by sitting down with you. I've had the honor of speaking with many scholars in my career. I'm honored. I'm honored. I've been wanting to speak with you for quite some time, and we finally made it happen. And just to let you know, out of all the people that I reached out to, letting them know about my new show, Dr. Horne was the first guest. He responded back less than 12 hours. I'll do it. He gave me the day and time. Dr. Horne, I appreciate it, but we're going to keep you after I, hit the stop button. Family, make sure you follow me on Facebook, Dashan Farad, as well as on Instagram, Dashan Farad Media. You've been watching Expressions in Blackness. Thank you very much for joining us. Hotep, peace.